we're improving.
We are. Okay, I'm going to share it out. Okay. Hello, hello. So Joe and Jeff are here again for a session, and I'm going to do some sharing for a couple of minutes. Make sure this is public, and make sure my pages get it. And maybe Jeff will do some sharing on his side also.
There you go.
Going to go to a few groups now. Our latest group is the Biden Records group. And of course, the Certified Letters group. President Bernie Sanders, the struggle continues for a People's Party. And a few others of our favorite groups. Okay, share again to some friends. I think meanwhile we're being helped, certainly by Sandy Degg, but I'm sure by a number of other folks too, who've probably gotten wind of this by now. And Bonnie just brought me a little bit of wine, so thank you, honey. There we go. I'm pretty much done now. So let's see where we are. Oh, I see where we are is that my camera's off again. I'll fix that. And Amber Lee says Vino's Kino. I like that. I think my sound is here at this point, but my camera has gone south, so hopefully it'll be a short fix. It is a short fix. So here we are. Joe and Jeff Epstein are here. Jeff is of activist, hashtag MMT. And he is going to be asking me questions again about the Fed, the eternal Fed.
How you doing, Joe? Good evening again.
Good evening, Jeff.
Hi, everybody in the live stream.
I guess we've got a lot of competition tonight, I suppose.
Hi, everybody in the live stream. Oh,
Thanks for holding the fort, Jeff.
oh yeah. Joe just told me in the private version of our stream, thanks for holding the fort. He's coming right back. I don't know what we don't know what happened.
Yeah, I'm back though. Okay, I know what happens. For some reason, uh, the feed is interfered with. I have no idea why. I'm
Oh
cabled up
yeah.
to the internet. It should be very solid,
Joe just told me.
but it's nowhere near as solid as it should be.
Hi, Amber and Sandy, and that's all I see. But hello.
And Robert Mueller is here. Hi, Robert. And Jeff Epstein, of course, is here. Steve Wolfbrandt is here. And Dolores Pierce is here. Hi, Dolores. How are you tonight? Please share this as much as you can. I see there has been considerable sharing going on so far. Thank you very much. Please do a little more sharing for us so people get to hear this important interview about the Federal Reserve. Okay, Jeff, I think we have enough people here to start.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Thank you again,
And
Joe, for
hi,
having me.
Dina Wilcats. How are you?
Thank you again, Joe, for having me. Yeah, I do have some more questions. I'd like to follow up. I'd like to tell you what happened with Graham. But actually, before we get started, I just want to wish Johnny Axam the best of health. He just posted on Twitter that he's struggling in the hospital with COVID, and I just posted my inter. I just put a link to my interview with Johnny in the comments. If you'd like to hear it, it's a really good interview, and I just want to wish him the best of health.
Right. Okay. And I want to join you in wishing him the best of health. We have had a couple of interviews. He and I, in fact, maybe three or four interviews, and we know each other very well. And I wish that he was here among us and was very healthy right now. He was feeling pretty bad yesterday. I saw I saw a message from him that said that he had too little energy yesterday.
What was it yesterday? I just saw it today. Here, I'm putting a link to the tweet in
Yeah,
the
please
comments.
do. Okay, if he was well enough to tweet, then he's better than yesterday.
Today is the 30th. No, this is from yesterday, and he says he's not doesn't have the energy to talk to anyone except for his son.
Right, that's the one I saw.
Okay. Um, well, I don't know, but well, before we get into it, just how are things? How's keeping your sanity, being trapped in the house?
I'm keeping my sanity. I have to admit, okay, every once in a while I have a panic attack, okay, over COVID. I think it's over COVID. It's just hard. It's a funny disease because the symptoms are not really too definite. If you don't have a fever or something like that, you can have it and you can still not know. Now, okay, and when you actually see a list of the symptoms that could be indicative of it, it overlaps with 100 of other things, so you can't really tell.
All right.
Okay, one thing that's clear though, okay, is that uh, if you're good at keeping yourself safe, if you wear gloves outside and you wear a mask, okay, to protect others more than yourself, and you don't go out too much, then you lower the risk of infection greatly. And that's very important. Hi, Lana. I guess you're here because someone said hi to you. So, Sandy said hi to you.
I have a suspicion. I have not spoken to him or heard anything, but my suspicion is that he had to go to work, and that was, just like a lot of people, they have to go to work because they're not given the support they need and could obviously be given, and then that causes them to get sick.
Yes, I know. And by the way, that is so outrageous. At this point, they should just be giving people the money they need to keep going so they can be whole, okay, and they can be safe. And they need to get all the protective equipment to people who are who are in the essential jobs, like the delivery jobs and the food processing jobs and the food selling jobs, and of course the healthcare jobs. And they need to make sure those people are provided for. And of course, the federal government's doing a terrible job at that. Just a terrible job.
Well, uh, terrible sort of. I don't know. There's I My instinct, my suspicion is that it's not they're trying but failing, but that they're doing exactly what they want to do.
They're doing exactly what they want to do, but I don't think they dreamt they'd be at this level of fatalities. As for the rest of it, they may be doing what they want, but I think the fatalities is not something they bargained for. I think they're going to get a lot worse before things get better, and especially if they try to open up again, there's going to be another surge in cases and another surge in the fatalities.
I don't know what New York is, but we have just reached about 119,000 in New Jersey.
Okay, I think that New York has one quarter of the cases in the United States.
Well, I would not be surprised if they're above 300,000
The
now.
state, okay, of New York. I heard a statistic on John Campbell's program today that indicated that the number of infected people in New York State is 13.9%. Okay, and the number of infected people in New York City uh, is 21%.
Yep.
So those are by far the highest rates of infection in the United States, and they are simply a disaster.
Yep. Um, yep. Yeah. So I had a little bit of what do you call it when you stay home for too long? Cabin fever. I had a little bit of cabin fever, but I'm glad to be talking with you. All right. Why don't we get started? Let me ask you. Well, actually,
Absolutely.
so I spoke with Graham 2 Mondays ago. We're dealing with some technical issues with the video file, but we're working on it. It should be okay. But it went really well. Um, you were particularly helpful in the final stages of the presentation. Uh, the I look forward to people seeing it. The intricacies of how the Treasury and the Fed work was a last minute change that you pushed very hard, and I think I finally understand it after soaking it in for a while. So I look forward to people seeing it. I have some follow up questions, so why don't I start with one, and that is the Treasury makes its deposit. Actually, I'll give it just a quick background just so people can get some background on what we're talking about. So when the Congress passes a law, you and I talked quite a lot about what actually happens with the Fed and with the Treasury. And what happens is that the Treasury has a bill, let's say Medicare for All has $1 trillion in new spending to build, let's say, new hospital wings. The Treasury already has some money in its Treasury spending account, their bank account at the Fed. So let's say that they have $800 billion and they need to get up to that point of 1 trillion. So they make a deposit into the Fed for 200 billion, the remaining part to top it off. And they make a deposit, which this was a part that was hard for me to get my head around, which was they make a deposit with, just like we do with a deposit slip, walk up to a teller to the deposits with a deposit slip and with assets. For us, it'd be pennies and cash and checks and bonds and whatever. For them, it would be tax revenue and a platinum coin. And what I was struggling with, and I think I know the answer, but I'm going to tell you what I think it is, and then you'll correct me, is they can have tax revenue and platinum coin and whatever else it is. But I think what's hard for me to get my head around is that the Fed creates reserves to fill up their account. But if the Treasury gives them assets, then it's always a one-to-one offset. So even though the Fed is creating money, that they're always removing that same amount of money, setting aside platinum coins at the moment, they're always removing the same amount of money from the real economy, from the private sector, even if it's being destroyed.
Yes.
So the Fed, but there is a way for the Fed to create reserves without any offsets. I know there has to be a way for the Fed to create, so one of those ways is the platinum coin.
Yeah.
Another way, and this is the part that I think is right, but this is just my instinct, and that is that the Treasury issues new securities that are unfunded, that the Fed fills up with reserves.
No.
Go. Okay, well.
The Treasury issues new securities, and the Federal Reserve holds an auction to sell those particular securities. And when the securities actually sell to the private agencies or people or companies, that buy them, then the Federal Reserve, in settlement, destroys the revenue from the securities, and that triggers a deposit in the Treasury spending account to top it up.
Okay, so that's another case of there is a one-to-one offset.
Yes, that's another case is a one-to-one offset. So when is there not a one-to-one offset?
Well, before you answer that, a platinum coin would be a case where there's not a one-to-one offset. That comes straight from just the minting of the coin itself through the president's, telling the Treasury Secretary to do that. Is there any Yeah, I guess what are the other cases? Because the concept of creating money out of nothing.
There's another case which has not occurred yet, in modern times. And the other case, since the creation of the Fed, and the other case is for Congress to order the Fed to top up the Treasury spending account. And I call that overt congressional financing. But
Okay, but how we are creating new money in service to implement new laws for new spending and new laws. But in all of these instances,
no. When Congress appropriates the money, what it's doing is, it's telling the Treasury you have to spend X funds. It's telling the Treasury, we're appropriating $100 million in spending. We're appropriating $100 billion, in spending for you to spend on this and that, and the other thing. That doesn't create any money, not by itself.
Review. What doesn't create any money by itself?
When Congress appropriates something, it is giving an order. It is giving an order to the Treasury Department to spend money on particular things, to spend a particular amount of money on particular things. Until Treasury spends that money, there hasn't been any money created in the private sector. So the question is, where does Treasury get that money?
Yeah.
And the answer today is that it mostly gets it from the Fed when the Fed creates new reserves in the Treasury spending account.
Right.
And we've been going over how the new reserves are created.
Okay. So aside from a platinum coin, the Fed, as for new spending and a new law, there's no case that I'm understanding yet of the Fed creating money without 100% offset by removing money from the private sector.
There's no case, okay, as yet. Well, it may have done something like that, okay, in the Second World War. I'm not clear, okay, on the history there. They did some very funny things, okay, in the Second World War. And Kennedy did some things at the beginning of the 1960s in issuing silver certificates. I don't know whether the silver certificates were actually accompanied by any tax revenues, okay, in any way, or by bond sales, okay, in any way. He may simply have created the silver certificates, okay, and issued them. But generally speaking, what you say, okay, is exactly correct. The offsets, okay, are always in terms of tax revenue collected and destroyed by the Federal Reserve. Okay, and also bond revenue collected and destroyed. The securities revenue collected as the securities are sold and then destroyed in settlement, but by the Fed before the Fed actually creates the new reserves for the Treasury spending account.
So all new spending is almost entirely or entirely offset by removing money from the private sector. And it's done through these these treasury auctions. That is, so the treasury deposits their treasuries, whether they're newly issued or not. Then the Fed sells those or auctions those off. That money is removed from the economy, from big banks, from big, very wealthy primary dealers, but ultimately it comes from almost entirely from the rich. And then the Fed creates those reserves, the Treasury spends those reserves and gives them to whoever. We get a pittance right now during the coronavirus. So this seems like another tool but it's called debt. It's called debt. That increases the debt. Even though it's 100% offset, it increases the debt. So my instinct is that it's an excuse to increase the debt, and that decreasing
the
the debt is an excuse for future austerity.
The securities that are sold are known as debt instruments. They're debt instruments of the Treasury, sold by the Treasury. Okay. So literally, in terms of the legal meanings of this, the Treasury is borrowing money that previously was in the private sector, okay, and it's incurring a debt to agents who are in the private sector. Okay, the debt is for the principal and the interest payments. And that's what they mean by the national debt subject to the limit. The interest payments are not a part of the national debt. But the principal payments, the sum of the principal payments that are due, constitute what we mean by the debt subject to the limit.
Okay. There's something seems very, very off here. That something seems very off here. There's something
Okay,
very
this
wrong with
is
that.
what
There's no
seems
new.
off. Okay, this is what seems off. What MMT always says is that the act of the Federal Reserve topping up the Treasury spending account is but separate from the taxing, okay, and the borrowing. Okay, and it is. Those are separate acts. And the Fed can top up the Treasury spending account without any taxing or borrowing actually going on. But for that to happen, there are two mechanisms that I speak of. The first one is the minting of $1 trillion coin and the deposit of that coin at the Fed. Okay, of course, it doesn't have to be $1 trillion coin. It could be $100 trillion coin. It could be $100 billion coin. But it's a high value platinum coin that is deposited at the Fed, becomes an asset of the Fed, and the Fed in return creates the new reserves, okay, to deposit in the Treasury spending account. Okay, that's the first method.
Okay.
And the second method is overt congressional financing.
Which has never happened. It should happen, but it's never happened.
Which has never happened, but it's basically, okay, it's my proposal for adding some fairly simple language to congressional appropriations bills, which will
That
mandate the Fed to add the money to spend appropriations to the Treasury spending account and to add the money to repay the debt and to pay the interest to the Treasury spending account.
then we are living in a scarcity, in a truly scarcity by choice. We are living in a truly scarcity mindset where we are not allowed to spend unless money, that exact amount of money, is taken out of the economy, and it's been that way. You're saying forever. So how are we surviving? Where is that money coming from? How are we? I mean, I should just go on to a different question now, or just a completely different subject.
Well,
This
no, I think, I may see what you're driving at, okay? I may see what you're driving at here. Uh, when the federal government actually deficit spends, okay, it may be pulling money out of the private sector, but it is adding a net financial asset to the private sector. The net financial asset that it's adding to the private sector is the Treasury security. Okay, because
but
the
they remove
Fed,
something in order to create that net financial asset.
well, what's happening is the Fed is filling up the Treasury spending account with some money, and the Treasury is spending that money into the economy. On the other end, the private sector is buying the new net financial asset,
Right.
which the Fed, okay, has issued. Okay, so the money basically cancels itself out.
Right. It's just swap. They're just swapping.
It's just a swap. But the net financial asset that's left into the economy is the Treasury security. Okay, now what happens after a while? The Treasury securities, okay, are going to build up in the private sector, okay, right?
Yeah.
And eventually, the Fed is going to perceive that there's an awful lot of Treasury debt that is out there in the private sector, and that, on the other hand, the reserves being held by the banks and by the financial corporations in their Fed accounts are getting tight, and people don't have any reserves to fund things anymore. So what happens then is that the Fed has to maintain essentially liquidity. So what it does to do that is that it swaps, it takes the Treasury Department debt in, it buys that debt, and it gives entirely new reserves, but to the financial sector. So that, okay, will loosen up, okay, the supply, okay, of reserves in the banking system and the Federal Reserve System again. Okay, and the end result is that the Fed has actually monetized the federal debt, but indirectly.
Meaning that they've purchased treasuries directly and replaced it with reserves.
Directly from the private sector. They're not allowed to purchase the Treasury securities directly from the Treasury.
From the Treasury, from the private sector.
Right, so they have to indirectly monetize.
So the Treasury offers
securities at a later date by buying back the money. I'm sorry, by buying back the securities from the private sector. Okay, the securities, okay, if you remember, were the net financial assets I spoke of. Okay, but they were not in the form of money. They were in the form of Treasury securities. Okay, but eventually, the Federal Reserve will convert them into money, into reserves in the banking system, and then they'll be there to back the loans, okay, and the deposits, okay, and the credits in the banking system.
So what I think you're saying, and I don't think I'm not at the stage where I even know what the questions are yet, as obviously I think you can see. But what I think you're saying is that not because we can't, but because of political decisions, because of laws, arbitrary laws, we don't create new money with no offsets, ever. We don't create new money with new offsets, which implies that there was a certain time where there was an X quantity of money, and that's all the money that we have to play with throughout all of time, except for the interest. So the new money is the interest growing on those treasuries. I can't see any other.
No. Okay, remember, the net financial assets that's injected into the economy by deficit spending from the Treasury. Okay, the net financial asset is the Treasury securities. Okay, but eventually the Fed is buying up the Treasury securities. And it is injecting new money into the economy to do that.
But the Treasury issues Treasury securities.
Yeah.
Treasury issues Treasury securities, which the Fed auctions off, right? Or that's directly sold to the private sector?
The Fed auctions that off.
So the Treasury allowed to sell Treasury securities directly to the private sector?
Well, I don't know whether it's allowed to by law or not, but I know the way it proceeds now, probably because the Fed is the banking agent before the Treasury Department. It's the Fed that holds the auctions.
Right.
It's always done that way now. The Fed holds the auctions.
So the Treasury can't sell their securities except through auctions at the Fed. Is that right? New issued securities.
I'm not going to say they can't. What I'm saying is the practice now is always to sell the new securities but through the auctions. Okay, now there may be
Okay.
some small security programs where where the Treasury is selling directly to the private sector. I think that was the case, okay, in World War II when people bought savings bonds. I don't think the savings bonds were sold by the Fed. I think they were sold by the Treasury Department.
Okay, but the Treasury issues all new treasuries currently through auctions at the Fed.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Treasury issues new treasuries, gives these empty, not empty is not the right word, gives these treasuries to the Fed. The Fed auctions them off. The private sector purchases them with existing money in the private sector. The Fed gives the Treasury security piece of paper to the private sector, and no money has been created. I'm not seeing it. So the Fed gets a security, Treasury auctions it off. Oh, auctions it off. So what is the face value of that security? What's whatever it is? It's a
Okay, let's
hundred.
say the face value of that security is $100. Okay, let's be simple. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so the private sector gives the auctioneer
Sandy.
the hundred
Sandy says Joe
dollars.
needs a whiteboard. I agree. Go ahead.
Okay? The
Yeah.
private sector gives the $100 to the auctioneer, and the auctioneer gives the Treasury security to the private sector guy.
And they
Okay? And then the auctioneer turns over the formerly private sector money. Uh, in other words, it settles the
destroys it and
transaction
then
and it
creates that
destroys the transaction and creates entirely new reserves, and the
of the
Treasury
exact
spends their
same amount.
account. Right. Okay.
So
So what is left? The Treasury is going to turn around and is going to deficit spend that $100.
so 100%
And
1-to-1 offset.
it's
Private sector
a one
removes.
to one offset. But what is left in the private sector is the Treasury security. That was not there before.
Oh,
So that's a net financial asset.
oh, I get it. Okay.
And then sometime later, the Fed just buys that Treasury security in return for reserves. $100 can reserves. That's when the new money gets added to the economy. So the new reserves that have been added to the economy over a very long period of time, okay, are the Treasury securities that have been bought by the Fed.
Okay. Okay. Oh my gosh. All right. The Treasury. Uh, the Treasury issues new securities. Why is it so funny? It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous how complicated this is.
The reason
Like how
why it's so
polluted I am.
complicated,
I'm
okay,
saying
the
also how
reason why it is so complicated, okay, is because they did not want the public to see. Okay, so there was this rule, okay, this rule that came down from gold standard days, okay, and the rule was that they didn't want the Federal Reserve to monetize the Treasury debt
to buy it directly from the Treasury.
by actually buying, right, from the Treasury.
That's the definition of monetize the debt is directly buy that as
Yeah,
opposed to this.
right. The Fed actually directly buying that. So those rules came down to us. When we went off the gold
Oh,
standard, those rules did not change.
because
Okay.
that
So we're
because
still using those rules today, except what happens today is that the Fed is free in order to maintain an adequate supply of new reserves. It's free to monetize the debt by way of the private sector, by buying the securities from the private sector.
okay. So the Treasury issues new securities, gives those securities to the Fed. The Fed auctions them off to primary dealers. Primary dealers give it's $100. They say they bid for $105. So $105 is given to the Fed. The Fed destroys that and then tops off the Treasury's spending account by $105. But now there is a new $100 piece of paper, a bond, Treasury, in the private sector. So that is the new thing. That's the new thing. And then later, that Treasury is exchanged or for new reserves at some point.
Yes, at some point in the future, some indefinite period, okay, in the future. Yes.
Oh my gosh. Okay, and that is an excuse to say that we have more debt.
Yes, it would be a lot simpler. Okay, it would be a lot simpler. Okay, and a lot simpler politically. Okay, if when the Treasury needed money to spend its appropriation from the Congress, the Federal Reserve was simply mandated to top up the Treasury spending account.
But
So
then they
that's
wouldn't be
why
able
I
to
suggested overt congressional financing.
but then they wouldn't be able to say we have debt and then later say we spent so much, we have so much debt, we are now trapped and we must tighten our belts.
Exactly.
And who suffers at the tightening of the
Exactly.
belt? Who
Yes,
suffers at the tightening of
exactly.
the belt?
They always want to be able to say, oh, the debt, the debt. So,
So
okay, for a while. So, wait. So, when just a few weeks ago, they passed the CARES Act. Okay, and
they care so much. Three
they care
times
so
they care.
much, right, for the big businesses. So, they passed the CARES Act and it created the $4.6 trillion dollar slush fund over at the Fed that was backed by the $454 billion that the Treasury, okay, was getting from the CARES Act. Okay, and everybody said, look, they're creating money, okay, and it's not actually offset, okay, by anything. Well, folks, it's now being offset because what is happening now later, in order to fill the Treasury spending account, the Treasury is currently issuing more debt. And that was in the news today that the Treasury Department has been holding auctions.
Treasury The Treasury Department has been holding auctions.
It's not holding auctions, but what I'm saying is the Treasury Department is issuing debt. The Fed is holding the auctions for the Treasury Department, and the Treasury Department is selling that debt into the private sector as we speak to back the CARES Act. I shouldn't say to back the CARES Act, but to create the trigger that the federal to create the trigger the Fed actually needs in order to fill up the Treasury spending account so it can spend the CARES Act appropriation. It's happening through deficit spending, and it's happening through selling Treasury securities. Yeah, federal debt is a private sector asset, Sandy. Exactly. Okay, so we're seeing it happen. So they did not just issue the CARES Act, okay, without an offset. They were planning to have the offset later. They were planning to drive up the debt later. And already the Republicans are starting to express, oh, how concerned we are. The debt is rising unprecedented degrees, as if they had nothing to do with it. It was the damn bailout you gave to the frickin' corpse.
Wait a minute. I think I get the concept of what you said, but I didn't get the specifics. So you're saying that the bill was passed and allowed to be spent without issuing new debt, without the Treasury issuing new treasuries, that they allowed this spending to be done without topping off. I mean, maybe that's wrong, but just roughly speaking. So without debt, without issuing debt, knowing that at some point it would have to be equalized one-to-one, which is like an automatic way of pre-creating fear-mongering. That, I mean, That's what you're saying. To an extent, that's what you're saying. That they knew that they could create it. Yeah, sure, we can create it now, but the law, this arbitrary decision, we know will kick in at some point soon to make it appear like the debt is exploding. I, I mean, roughly, I know. I know.
They
I'm
knew
sort of
they would
around there.
either have to raise taxes or issue more debt. And what they're doing to do that spending, okay, is to issue more debt. And they may even come back at some time soon and say, "Oh, we have a debt ceiling crisis. We have to raise the debt ceiling."
So, how did they? They had to issue debt now, which I believe that implies that they did not have to issue debt before. And by issuing debt, it just means the Treasury issues new securities, which are then auctioned off by the Fed. So, how was this done? You're saying that it was done with a temporary authorization to create it without having to do it through this debt issuance?
No, 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 no. What happens is that when the appropriation bill passes, what it does is it mandates that the Treasury Department will spend a particular amount.
Right.
It's up to the Treasury Department to finance that amount. Either it happens through taxation or it happens through the issuance of debt instruments.
Right. I understand that.
Or it can happen through the platinum coin, too.
I understand what you just said. What I'm not understanding is why the delay in time. That spending should happen immediately. The debt issuance should happen immediately. So why this delay that the debt suddenly is
Well,
being
it
issued
doesn't
now?
actually happen immediately. All the spending doesn't happen, okay, the day after the appropriations bill. It takes
Um,
time to spend the money, and there's also a certain amount of money in the Treasury spending account to start with.
well, it takes time to do what the bill says should be done.
Yeah, so it
So
takes
it
time to spend the money.
okay.
It takes time for the Treasury to spend the appropriation.
So Medicare for all, they want to build things on hospitals. They don't send out all 100 trillion right at once. They send it out as the contract is fulfilled. When this thing is built or when this thing is done, that's when they pay for that thing. That's what you're saying. So the delay is just a natural process.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So debt is issued, and then that debt, those treasuries through this auction, in the future, is used to buy new reserves in asset swaps.
Right.
Then the Fed, then that piece of paper is given back, that is removed from the private sector. The reserves in the public sector, I think that's accurate to say, in the banking reserve system, which is the public sector, is increased, so that debt is decreased when there's an asset swap. That debt is decreased when there's an asset swap. Huh. So new spending is new debt. Asset
The
swap.
debt, when there's an asset swap, in other words, when the Fed does, when it buys the securities back from the private sector, that does not reduce the national debt. Okay, the reason why it doesn't actually reduce the national debt is because the regional Federal Reserve banks that are buying the debt, okay, they're still holding the debt, and the Treasury at some future time has to buy back the debt from them. In other words, the Treasury still has to redeem those securities when the time comes to redeem those particular securities.
So the Fed, who does not need a profit, is holding those treasuries until their maturity or whatever. Then the Treasury buys them back and gives the Fed money that they don't care about.
The Treasury gives interest
To the
to
Fed.
the Fed, okay, and to the extent, okay, Okay, so now comes another little wrinkle in the situation.
I don't think I can take it.
You can take it. Okay. The Federal Reserve has kind of an overhead fee on things of 6%. In other words, 6%, okay, let's say 6%, okay, of the transactions or the revenue, okay, it takes in goes to the Fed for operating costs.
Okay, paying salaries, whatever.
The rest of what the Fed is taking in constitutes the profits the Fed, okay, is making. No, I'm not actually saying this right. Okay, say the Fed has profits. Okay, say that it profits like, uh, I don't know, let's say 6 billion a year or 7 billion a year or something like that.
Okay.
Then 6% of those profits will be retained by the Fed, but 94% of those profits goes back to the Treasury Department. It rebates 94% of its profits back to the Treasury Department.
Okay.
Okay, so the Treasury Department is contributing to those profits with the interest payments, okay, it's making on the securities. Okay, but the Fed is then turning around and is rebating 94% of that back to the Treasury.
Okay. So
It's more legerdemain, which
more
is
what?
unnecessary.
More what?
Okay, it is more legerdemain, which
Oh, I
is
don't. What is that word?
okay, LEDGERMAIN, which is sort of a synonym for magic or obscure transactions, okay, of one
Skillful use of
kind,
one's
okay, or
hands for
another.
performing conjuring tricks.
Yeah, ledger domain.
Okay.
So that is another kind, okay, of ledger domain, which is the price we pay for not having the Federal Reserve as part of the Treasury Department.
Okay. So this brings up the 454 billion, which is to back the potential 4.6 trillion dollars in loans. So they can, 3% might default. So 454 is around 10%. So they're assuming that they're not going to reach that high, so they don't have losses. The Federal Reserve, they don't care about profit, and in a way, they don't care about losses. What I think this is that this avoids them having to go back to Congress to get authorization to be able to create more. It's giving them a buffer
Yeah,
because
right. It's because the Federal Reserve is not supposed to operate on an appropriation fight, from Congress. It's supposed to operate on, what it gets, but through transactions. It's
okay.
that kind of independent agency of the federal government.
So the only way to lower the debt is for the Treasury to just buy up treasuries. Is for maturing treasuries to be taken by the Treasury, and the Treasury spends that money for the amount that that maturing bond or Treasury was for. So the same amount of money is in the private sector, but those treasuries are now destroyed after they're redeemed or whatever you call it, matured. So no amount of money has changed. The amount of money has not changed. It's just not called debt anymore. That's right.
Oh, the amount of money may have changed. Okay, the net financial assets in the private sector have certainly changed.
They hand in a treasury for 100 plus interest. The treasury pays 100. They create new, I guess, for the interest part. So the interest is new money.
The interest is new money, but the way the Treasury gets the interest it pays to the Federal Reserve is very
Uh,
frequently by issuing new debt. In other words, the cycle simply starts all over again.
sorry. No, please don't. Thanks for asking. Bye. Sorry. He's economically accurate, so that's good. Um, all right. So I'm sorry. I missed the final thing you said, Joe.
Okay, the final thing I said is the process simply starts all over again. Okay, if the Treasury has to pay interest to the Fed, how does it get the interest money? It gets it, okay, because it has collected taxes and gotten some new additions into the Treasury spending account, okay, which allow it to pay the interest to the Fed, okay, or it's issued some more securities that it's sold, and it's gotten, some further injections, but from the Fed that are based on the new securities. Okay, it's sold, and so the cycle keeps on repeating and repeating. Okay, and repeating.
So the Treasury spending account already has money in it, as we discussed previously.
Yeah.
So it uses that money to pay off maturing treasuries. So if it goes below what people want to redeem, then they must issue the Fed treasuries to auction off in order to get that money to pay it off.
Yeah.
So the amount of debt is just it's just a policy variable. They could just choose whatever they want it to be. I mean, obviously.
They could
Yeah, okay.
choose whatever they want it to be. If they did overt congressional financing, they could pay off all the debt gradually within 30 years. And there wouldn't be any inflation caused by that.
There wouldn't be. I mean, it's just a massive ruse. Okay, I still have a ton to learn about that, but
It's
the
just a
idea that the
massive
new
ruse. And every time it seems like it's not a massive ruse, you have to think it through and see again why it's a massive ruse.
I mean, I've been studying this stuff for more than 2 years now, and you can. This is still unreal how much I have to learn. Okay, so
No, it's
what
not
I
so
was
much
missing.
that you have to learn. Okay, in other words, what you have to learn from this point is all of a sudden you just have to grok it. It has to be grokked.
So I have all the pieces; they're just not connected.
Yeah, you have to grok it. You have to see the whole.
I had the puzzle; it's just all the pieces are like this, and they have to. Okay, what I was missing, the light bulb that I had tonight is that piece of paper is now that is the net financial asset. That's just a piece of paper that later can be redeemed asset swap for new reserves. But the Fed is holding it, so it's debt. This meaningless piece of paper is still debt at the Fed until the Treasury buys it. But the Treasury buying it, assuming they have that money, then it just
When the
that
Treasury buys it, at that point, okay, the security is destroyed.
and then the debt. And by definition, that means the debt is down. And actually, Amber said another way is through taxation. Of course, the debt can be lowered through taxation. Okay. I'm gonna switch subjects. That I think I got as much as I want to get there tonight.
Okay.
I mean, thank you for. I mean, it's just
It's
when
just
I'm.
ridiculous, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it is ridiculous. I mean, I'm struggling with the questions, but I think how can you blame me? I guess. Okay. Let's switch subjects a little bit, and that is the hold on. I really, really need you to not be here. I'm talking with people that are watching live now, and I need you to walk away and not come back. You have to talk with mommy. I love you. Goodbye.
But when you're done, can you flash it to
Sorry. Okay. You said last week or last time we spoke that the maintaining the stability of the banking system. I asked, my question was, is that equivalent, is maintaining the stability of the banking system equivalent to saying protecting their interest rate? And you said it is a part of it. So protecting their interest rate, that implies that protecting the interest rate is a superset of maintaining the stability of the banking system. So can you
Well,
clarify that?
what I think, okay, is implied actually is that it's a subset
Please.
of what it takes, okay, in order to maintain
Wait.
the banking system. Okay, in order to maintain the stability of the banking system, okay, it also has to regulate the banks, okay, in order to try to make sure that they're not going crazy with speculation, that there's not too much concentration in the banking sector. Of course, I think the Fed has been doing a very poor job of that part of its job. In other words, there's been an overwhelming amount of concentration, okay, that's been going on in the banking sector. To the extent concentration is a threat to the stability of the banking system, the Fed hasn't been doing what it's mandated to do. In other words, what its primary function is. I think it's been failing in that respect, okay, for a long time, because I don't think the capital rules, but for the private banks, are actually strict enough. I don't think the problem is on the reserve side, but I think the capital requirements should be tightened, and it's allowing the banks to do things that should never be allowed, simply because they're too speculative, and banks can get themselves into trouble because they speculate in the international gambling casino. Okay, so I don't think the Fed has been doing a very good job at the regulation part of its job.
But its overall mandate is to manage, is to maintain the stability of the banking system, setting aside employment stuff.
Yes.
So what does it mean to say protecting? How does that relate to protecting? I believe it's the way to say it is protecting its interest rate.
Okay, because if the overnight funds rate were free to vary, okay, then it could suddenly shoot up or it could suddenly go down, okay, to zero. And the Federal Reserve, in order to maintain the stability of the banking system, thinks that it has to maintain the stability of its target interest rate. It may have a target interest rate which is close to zero, but maybe not quite okay at zero. Okay, it may have a target interest rate at 1%, 2%. Certain times it had a target interest rate of 5%. And once it even had a target interest rate that I guess went as high as 20%.
And the consequence of that, if it goes to, what are the consequences of the high end and low end of it losing control of its interest rate?
Okay, if the
Which,
interest rates go too high, then the banks won't be able to pay interest and won't be able to borrow money and won't be able to meet by their requirements for reserves, and won't be able to lend money.
well, there are no requirements anymore. It was just
Right,
switched a few weeks ago. After many,
right,
many years, it was just switched to 0%.
right.
So there are no reserve requirements. So
Right, but if the interest rate goes too high, okay, then the individual banks are going to have to offer loans at a higher rate, okay, than that. And
to
then
each
the
other, to
private
each other.
sector won't be able to afford to take those loans. Okay, it will lead in the end to an absence of credit, but for the private sector, and the Fed can't allow that.
Okay, so this is, I know that this is circular. What I'm about to, well, my thinking right now is circular. So it costs too much for them to lend to each other if the interest rates go too high, so they won't purchase it from each other, and then somehow that passes on higher interest rates for the loans that they make to the private sector, which is bad. But the Fed is a currency issuer, so they can fill up the reserves to whatever it needs to be at any time. So this is a circular thing. What am I missing here?
It can drive down the interest rates, okay, any time, okay, by issuing reserves. Yes, okay, it can. But from the standpoint, okay, of management, it doesn't want to have a volatile situation with respect to the interest rates. It wants to maintain the interest rate, okay, at a particular a steady amount, so that the psychological expectations of people who are operating inside of the banking system are kept at a calm level. Their
Yeah,
expectations are the interest going to be this, business can
yeah,
go on, there has to be a certain degree of certainty, okay, in the
yeah.
system. So the Fed doesn't want its overnight interest rate, going all over the place.
So okay, so I think I was introduced. I think okay, so they purchase from someone else, from another bank, their loans. The bank will say the interest rate is too high, and then so that bank will turn to the Fed and say the interest rate is too high. You need to do something about this, and then the Fed will do an asset swap to create reserves to alleviate that situation. And the only real world thing that we need to be concerned about is that that bank has enough capital, which includes financial stuff plus actual real world stuff, in order to cover that asset swap.
No, no, not just to cover the asset swap. These banks are making loans. If the loans are not actually repaid by the private sector, then the banks will suffer a loss. And when they suffer a loss, that decreases their capital.
Right.
Okay, and eventually the banks can go bankrupt. And that creates the instability in the banking system we're talking about.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I I'm grasping little things here, but yeah, they're not connected yet. So okay. Um. So can you talk a little bit about, do you have you the 0% reserves? Last we spoke, they didn't implement, or we didn't realize that they had implemented this because we didn't discuss that. But then the day of, or the night before, yeah, the night before I spoke with Graham, we realized that they had 0% reserves. So a lot of what I was going to talk about with him was now incorrect, because 3 weeks previous they stopped having a 10% or whatever it was interest reserve requirement after many years, and now it's zero.
Yeah,
So
yeah. At will, overnight.
I told Graham, I spoke as if we still had that reserve requirement, because I still think it's valuable to understand it, because we had that for a long time. Although I told him this just ended 3 weeks ago, I haven't learned about it yet. Just letting you know.
Yeah, we
But
may have it again in 6 months.
okay, well, can you talk about the 0%? How that changes this process?
Well, what it does is it means that even after the fact, the banks are not forced to go into the overnight market to get any more reserves, because they don't have a requirement, okay, for reserves. Okay, in other words, a particular percentage of the transactions don't have to be backed by uh, uh, such an amount of by the reserves they're holding.
Okay.
Okay, I mean it's as simple as that.
And it's just so now they just
Okay,
so
instead of
before
having to have, let's say, 3 billion, okay, in reserves, suddenly they don't have to have any reserves at all.
okay, so it's just as simple as before they could make loans as long as they had real world assets and 10% reserves. But
No,
now
it was never a prior constraint on their making loans. It was always a post hoc
okay.
constraint.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, yeah.
remember that. That's
Yeah,
very
yeah, yeah.
important
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because there was no
Understood.
fractional reserve system really operationally in effect.
Yep. Understood. So they don't have to when they make loans, they don't have to consider their reserves at all. They
Right.
have to just after this 2 week period of getting the average of balances over that 2 week period, that's when they have to make sure that that percentage of that average balance is met.
Right. So
So
they have 2 weeks to go into the reserve market, okay, and get the reserves. But since they now have a zero reserve requirement, they don't have to go into the reserve market at all to get the reserves.
right. So it's
So
like
that changes things operationally.
what's the point of having why not just have banks just do whatever the hell they want? I mean, it's just so okay.
Well, in Canada, they've been operating for years with zero reserve,
Right.
zero reserve requirements, and their banking system hasn't failed as a result of that. So it's obvious that those requirements were not necessary.
Yeah. Okay.
If they were not necessary up in Canada, they're not necessary here either.
Hmm.
Yeah, they were just kind of a hangover from the gold standard again.
Yeah, I am missing something very big, or at least, that the connection. I'm not going to keep pushing this particular thing because
Yeah, you
I'm just
probably
not
just
I'm just
have
not
to.
seeing it.
What you probably just have to do is sleep on it.
Yeah. Um okay, hold on.
Solana says, every time my closers hit the fund button, that is a direct line to a Fed wire. No one calls the branch to make sure that enough cash is available. Those are separate functions. So she's telling us they're simply separate functions.
Wait, every time it's fun, no one calls the branch to make sure enough cash is available. What's a separate
Her
fund? What?
closers are the loan closers.
No one calls to make sure there's enough cash is available. Oh, determining that there's enough reserves is a separate function from making loans. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I understand
That's what
that.
she's telling us. She's telling us true.
All right, let's switch subjects. Let's switch subjects. This is just so nebulous. It's just so nebulous. I am getting pieces, but let me just switch subjects. Stephanie Kelton's paper, Hierarchy of Money. I read it. Very interesting. On the first time, I read it a first time, but it really didn't things didn't really hit me until the second time I read it. The first thing I want to say is that you initially suggested that I read this paper for the purpose of understanding that a bank account, my bank account, is not a claim on their reserves. That question in particular did not seem to be answered, or I didn't get it. So I am not understanding this concept of my bank account is not a claim on their reserves. But what I'm thinking is that it's like sort of similar to a Fed auction. They get revenue from the Treasury auction. They destroy that revenue and then they create new reserves for the Treasury spending account. And I have a feeling that this is similar to that, where I know this is wrong, but I have a claim on their reserves. And what that does is just instructs the banks that they can destroy reserves and then give me not reserves, just money but they've lowered their reserves to compensate for that.
Okay, so I don't know what you mean by claim on the reserves of the bank. Let's say you have in your account $25,000. Okay, for example. Okay, and let's
Okay.
say you want to close your bank account there. Okay, and you want to shift your $25,000 over to another bank. And so you do a deposit from your account, your current bank, to the other bank, okay, where you've established, okay, an account.
Hmm.
Okay? Okay. So your bank then says to the other bank, you're going to receive a money transfer for $25,000, okay, to deposit, okay, in Mr. Epstein's account. Okay, and it sends a message, and lo and behold, you have a $25,000 credit, okay, in your new account.
Right.
And your old account, okay, is actually debited. Now, right now, at this particular moment, I don't see why that's a claim on the reserves in your current bank.
Well, your bank account is just a number, 25,000.
Right.
They have no, they don't have. They don't even have those reserves in a 0%. I don't know. The you have the right to withdraw $25,000 from that bank,
Yes.
and but that up until you do that action, up until you do that withdrawal, it's just a number in a cell in a spreadsheet at the bank, and it is a claim to some. It is a claim in some sense. You have a claim on that $25,000.
Yeah, you have a claim on $25,000. You have the right to shift that $25,000 over to another bank. You have the right to withdraw $25,000 in cash, but probably over a period of time because they probably have a limit. That you'd be able to withdraw $500 a day in cash. Now, cash is real money. It's hard money.
Right.
It's high-powered money, okay, of the federal government. So technically, yeah, you do have a claim on actual high-powered money, okay, of the federal government. But mostly in the banking system, you'll be essentially transferring your claim from one bank to another bank.
Right.
In other words, you'll be transferring, okay, a deposit from your bank, okay, into another bank. And since both banks will be members of the Fed system, they'll just accept the transfer because the credit of the first bank is good for the transfer.
Yeah, it's pretty bizarre. So my $25,000 is just because the bank says it is.
Yeah.
There's nothing behind it. Especially now,
Yeah.
there's nothing behind it.
Fiat money.
Oh, shit. Okay.
Okay, but
So
in this case, it's not even high-powered fiat money. It's bank money.
it's, I mean, you can't you can't hold reserves by definition because that's just computer digits in the banking at the Fed. You can never touch that. By definition, a person can't touch high-powered money, right?
Hmm.
Not by definition, but
Well, a person can touch cash. Cash is high-powered money. There is a certain amount of high-powered money in cash. When we look at that, okay, in the aggregate, it's a very small part, okay, of the money supply. but you know, you do have a right to a certain amount of cash. So you have a right to a certain amount of hard-powered money that you can actually hold in your hand.
Then what's bank? What you said, bank credit or bank money? That's just the number in the bank account.
Yeah, the bank money is just a number in the bank account. Right.
Okay, so I don't have the right to exchange that for reserves, which is why it's not high-powered money. But
You don't have the right to exchange that for reserves that were created by the Federal Reserve Bank. No.
yeah, okay, so that's why it's okay. Okay, my takeaway from this paper, I think, is so. I think some of the details are wrong, but I think the concept. There's an important concept here, and that is the idea of metallism, which is, I think, quite related to barter, and then chartalism. Basically, I think this is wrong what I'm about to say, but I think there is something related to this.
Okay.
The government is the people as a collective, workers as a collective. The market is capital as a collective. I think that's roughly true. And metallism or barter, the myth of barter, essentially makes the market this collective of capital, the bosses, the rich people, the center of the universe. And that metallism in the paper, they talk about how metallists say that if you analyze money, like I think even I can't think of his name. I can't think of his name at the moment. If you think of money as anything except for an even exchange for something else, that it's worth something, that the money is worth something itself, then that's not real analysis. That the only real analysis, according to metallists, at least the part that I'm remembering in the paper, is that money is a commodity, that it's something that can be exchanged, that is worth something on its own, like gold is worth something on its
That
own.
it supposedly has some kind of intrinsic value.
Intrinsic value, where the chartal view is that it is a representation of a relationship where there's one side has a debt and one side has an asset. And actually, I guess it can be both ways.
Yeah.
So they're saying that it's not real metallists are saying that it's not even real analysis to consider anything beyond that commodity. And it seems to me that this is a tension of capital, the rich people, the bosses who own the stuff that makes stuff, capital, their effort to try and make the market the center of the economic universe, and to make people not realize the state power behind it, and therefore their own power, because there's a lot of there's that in the metalist view that once states came in, that they were used to verify the quantity and quality of the commodity money, like that the gold coin was truly this weight, and the government is who verified that was the case. So that the government is like this incredibly large and strong but completely stupid being whose only job was to take the gold, weigh it, verify that it was accurate, and send it out, give it their stamp of approval, but not do anything else. So it like brings up these issues of if the government has a military, they're clearly bigger than any business. They have incredible power, but in the metalist view, they're only used to verify, the weight of the commodity money, and in service of the market. So to some sense, it seems to be a tension between market is a collective of capital, government is a collective of workers, and that the metalist view is in a way to make people not realize the power of government. So that's I think I have some of the details wrong, but I feel like that's where this is coming from. Am I anywhere in the ballpark, or even a few blocks from the ballpark, Joe?
That's not something that I know. In other words, for me, the government is, or should be anyway, uh, the creation of the people. Okay, and it itself, okay, is an institution that arises through the perception of the people that the government is a legitimate government. In other words, it has the idea that it is the government, okay, it should be the government, it has the authority to govern us, and if we value order, we ought to give the government a certain amount of allegiance, okay, and obedience. And whether the government actually represents a collective of workers, okay, or a collective, okay, of everybody. I think empirically in history, sometimes it represents everybody infrequently. Sometimes, okay, it does a better job, okay, of representing, okay, an elite, and this is the more common situation. And where the elite actually comes from will vary from society to society, and the extent of the permanence, okay, of the elite, okay, is going to be different. But most situations, in most countries, in most societies, tend towards the creation of some form, okay, of oligarchy, and that it's very hard to keep a democracy going. And you always have to do so by somehow refreshing it from the bottom up. And the people who are running the nation are always going to try to resist that, and they're going to try to stop you from doing that. And that's what the game of politics is all about, okay, in my view.
Oops.
I don't want to call it a game because I don't think it's a game. I think it's a really serious matter.
Andrew, get out of here. What are you doing? Get out of here. Hold on. I need you to go. Andrew, I need you to go. Go. Do not let me see you again. I love my children. I do.
know you do.
I just want to assure you.
I know you do. I can see that.
Okay. I obviously was distracted. I missed the end of what you said. Forgive me.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so essentially what I was saying is that I don't think it's correct to say the government, okay, is a collective of the workers.
Well, yes, it is a collective of everybody, but
Okay, it may be a collective, okay, of everybody. It depends on how you define a collective, and depends on how you define everybody.
okay.
Okay, there is something we call the government that in our system today tends to rule over nations. And it has varying degrees, okay, of authority over the nations and the peoples, okay, that it rules over. Okay, and the people have a varying degree of influence over their government, depending on the particulars of space and time. And maybe that's all we can say about it.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Fair enough. There is. Why don't we do a final thing for tonight, and that is a rather thick sentence that I read in Nathan's blog, and if you wouldn't mind just helping me fight that through, I'm going to type it. I'm going to type it into the comments, and then we can talk about it. It's just going to take a moment.
Okay.
Okay, there you go. The Fed can adjust its interest rate target, but it still must supply settlement balances at some price, and that's his emphasis. This is in the Fed Response Part 1. So this is one of his earliest articles. Might as well get that while you're looking at it.
Still must supply settlement balances at some price. I don't know what he means by supplying settlement balances.
Yeah, it's in
Okay,
this
the
article I'm
Fed
posting now.
still has to lend money at the discount window, and if it's going to lend money, okay, if it's going to lend some reserves at that window, it has to set a price for the reserves at the discount window. It may be that's what he's talking about.
And that price.
Okay, the price at the discount window.
Oh, the discount window.
Right, at the discount window is going to be somewhat above its interest rate target.
Okay, so
Okay,
the price is simply
interest rate target is the interest rate for the overnight market, and if it isn't able to get the reserves in the overnight market, then it's going to have to go to the discount window.
Okay, so we need some
context. It's going to have to pay a little more, and the Fed is going to have to set the price for that. I think that's what he means there.
Okay, yeah, it requires, I guess, some context. You can see it in the article if you need to, but I think that answers what I was interested in.
Good.
That
was easy.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, not quite as organized as before tonight. I did have one. This sort of related, sort of not related. Just an interesting observation. I was talking with whatever, I forget who, but I came to the conclusion that, what was it? Let me give me a moment to remind myself here. Yeah. Okay. Full employment. I was talking about full employment. Oh yeah, I was. I was really. I spent quite a bit of time this week learning about something called consumer monetary theory. Have you ever heard of this? CMT?
Yes, I have. It's something that someone else has recently advanced. They're trying to create a competitor, okay, to MMT.
Yeah.
I forget who's putting this forward.
Yeah, his name. Well, it doesn't matter who it is. It's some guy. I debated, not debated, whatever. I had a discussion with the supporter of this, and he started off the conversation. This is actually an interesting story. It's a good way to end this. He started off the conversation with, I agree with 90% of MMT. But what he ended up, what they support, CMT supports, what they disagree with is the federal job guarantee, the idea of full employment as a goal. They disagree. They think that is a bad idea. And they, what was the other major thing is, that taxes drive spending, the state theory of money. So they agree with 90% of MMT, except for the seed that MMT is built upon.
Yeah.
So, but we have total agreement on top of that foundation that has nothing on, that's built on this foundation of nothing. So basically, it's basically, as far as I can tell, basically a libertarian free market. We want what they call, they have a UBI, but it's called a CBI, calibrated basic income. And the idea of a calibrated basic income is they always calibrate it so that it, by definition, does not trigger inflation. By definition, because it is always calibrated to not trigger inflation. So I guess always approach, but never reach inflation. So that assumes that zero is never the calibrated amount, and that assumes that infinity is never the calibrated amount. And if they keep calibrating it, then people next month will have to get less, or because it's calibrated, because it has to be. And also their goal is not full employment, it's full prosperity. What's prosperity? That's a rather abstract, subjective term. Who decides what prosperity is? And the conversation ended with that this guy, not the one who's this is a supporter of CMT, ended with, I don't trust the government to do the right thing with their power of creating money. So therefore, I just want them to create money and give it to the people so that they can decide what to do with it. And that's pretty crazy, because the government will have to create massive amounts of money. And their power is not just the money, but the other side of it. They have infinite power to screw this up. And so what this led me to start thinking of was, full employment. What is full employment? Another thing that this person who actually promotes, the founder of this CMT, claims that we have been pursuing full employment for more than 100 years and it's just not working. And yes, according to this person, the MMT job guarantee will achieve full employment. But that's not a good thing, because achieving full employment is a bad thing. Because if we do full employment, then it will chew through Earth's resources at an alarming rate. That's a quote. So, they work for or die, just that whole thing. But the term full employment, obviously we have not been pursuing it. We've been pursuing a bastardized, a distorted version of full employment for 100 years. But what it led me to was this idea that the term full employment has been distorted. In addition to that, our measurement of current employment has been distorted. So not only can they decide where to draw the finish line on the ground, they can also put obstacles on the track. They can also shrink the track. They can also, make the track longer, or they can do whatever they want to do to prevent us from reaching that goal. But they can also do more than that. They can also propagandize us so that we don't even know the right direction to run in. And then there's the Federal Reserve, which has their mandate of maximum employment. Maximum employment is as many people working roughly, as many people as working as possible, as long as it doesn't trigger inflation. No one understands what inflation means. The general public doesn't understand what inflation means. So the distortion of the term full employment, the distortion of the measurement of current employment, now in addition to that, the distortion of this inflation, which nobody understands. And yeah, so there's four things there. They draw where the finish line is. They can put obstacles on the course itself. They can make the course difficult to run on. They can propagandize to just plainly, further distort these things so that the people don't even know where the finish line is. And then they can add additional terms onto it, such as inflation, such as the debt and the deficit and so on, that they have infinite control. They have infinite control to pretend that they want to keep all the people employed, but to actually keep nobody employed. And the same thing is true with UBI, with money. They can give you money, but who cares? Because they have infinite control over what money is, over how much its value is, over the resources that it can purchase. They can restrict the number of resources they have infinite control. So a UBI is this, one piece of that, in hopes that nothing around it will change. None of the other pieces will change. And any of those other pieces changing can completely sabotage your piece. So it's been an interesting week with this CMT. I actually wrote a rather substantial article about it, and I very painfully decided that I'm not releasing it because it's just libertarian pretending that they care about MMT.
That's what it sounds like. It just sounds like people trying to get some traction by doing something similar to MMT. Now, that's happened actually before, along about the 2012. There was a group that called themselves the monetary realists, and they soon changed that to modern monetary realists.
Oh.
And they were people who were involved, with MMT for some time, but they fell out of agreement with MMT over the job guarantee. And but Cullen Roche, who was the prime figure, in this group.
What was it? What was the name of the thing again?
It was known, as modern monetary realism. In other words, it was MMR, instead of MMT.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't care for the job guarantee either. And they didn't think full employment should be one of the major goals of MMT. They were for price stability, but they were also for prosperity, as a major goal.
Right.
So
what is prosperity?
Two major goals.
What is prosperity? Who gets to define prosperity?
In other words, the MMTers, including myself, often refer to public purpose. So what is public purpose?
Okay, but that's one thing. But full employment is another thing. That has a rather definitive.
We think that that full employment is one of the components of public purpose.
But my point is,
we think price stability is another component, of public purpose.
But full employment is a definitive thing. Everybody who wants a job at a fair wage benefit has an opportunity to get that job.
That is the MMT definition, of full employment. There's no consensus on that as a definition of full employment, in economics.
I'm not talking about economics. I'm talking about reality. And MMT defines full employment as everybody who wants a job can have a job or opportunity for a job. That is a rather...
Yes. It defines it, as everybody who wants a job at a living wage with good fringe benefits can have a job at a living wage with good fringe benefits. Yes, that is the definition of full employment.
And that is a reasonably concrete, objective thing.
Yes.
So yes, we might say public purpose, which then it comes into what does public purpose mean? Who gets to define that? But when that is on top of the job guarantee, it is much less subjective. And Lana is asking, what's it called? It's called consumer monetary theory. So if you search for, I'm pretty sure if you just search for consumer monetary theory, you will find the article I'm talking about. And monetary theory. Yeah. And then you'll see Introduction to Consumer Monetary Theory. It's an article. And I watched two videos. So this guy, the supporter, that I was talking to, I feel suckered because he started off with I agree with 90% of MMT. And so I'm like, okay, cool. He's mostly on board. And then gradually, it was like, he started off with, I've seen deficit owls. I agree with most of it. He even he said he watched, I believe he did, Bill Mitchell's Most Progressives Are Actually Neoliberals in Disguise, which is a great video. He said, yeah, I pretty much agree with that too. And then he said, here's CMT. Watch this. And I watched it in exchange. I watched it, I felt like he did something for me. And so I watched it. I was just gobsmacked within 5 minutes. And I started writing. And I just couldn't believe what I was watching. And it consumed me for like 24 hours. And as I said, I wrote an article and I watched another one of his videos. I read his introduction article, and then I watched another one of his videos because he says that, so we calibrate the CBI, calibrated basic income, which is a UBI, but it's calibrated so it, by definition, never triggers inflation, which seems pretty insane. But he said, the article said that it talks about how it's calibrated in this 2-hour video. So I watched this 2-hour video, and the only time it talks about how it's calibrated is about 15 seconds. And that 15 seconds is, we don't know what the amount should be, which is why we start off small and we gradually ramp it up until it starts showing signs. And then we pull back. Oh, okay, great. Yeah. So I lost the point of what I was saying, but that is pure. The goal is purely subjective, prosperity. And there was one other question.
Prosperity for whom? Prosperity for what?
But again, it's the government that they don't trust. That's who has to decide what prosperity is. Are the people going to decide what prosperity is? When, again, it's that they choose where the finish line is. They choose how to get to that finish line. They can propagandize people and so on and so on. So when have they reached prosperity? When, who is going to make all these decisions to calibrate this UBI, this CBI, that hundreds of millions of people's lives depend upon, who are sitting at home getting a check? Lots of people are going to choose not to have a job. Now they're not involved even more. So what power do they have to give input of this CBI is not satisfactory for me? So, yeah, it's a mess. There was one other. Alana also said Nehru has not been in place for 100 years. Yes, I know but that doesn't mean that we haven't been not pursuing it. We have not been pursuing full employment, as MMTers would define it. Like even the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration gave into racism. So yeah, there was Social Security, there was big programs, but they were not given to disadvantaged communities, at least a substantial amount of it, as I understand it.
Yeah, I think the federal government was actually trying to pursue full employment for a brief time during the 1960s. And then it just became something hard for them to accomplish. Okay, and then the neoliberal philosophies came in, okay, and Nehru came in, and that interrupted the whole effort. But it used to be the case that I think the Democrats were giving more than lip service to full employment as a goal.
I understood Republicans actually at some point were pushing for unions and I believe full employment. Maybe I'm wrong.
They were pushing for unions, okay. In other words, in the Eisenhower administration was relatively friendly to unions. But I think it's true to say most of the Republican Party was never particularly friendly to unions. But as for the Democrats, during the 1950s, they ran on a full employment type platform. They tried to support the idea of full employment in Congress. And when the Kennedy-Johnson administration came in, it tried to pursue full employment. And I think even when Nixon took over, there was some degree of drive towards full employment. And then that got lost in the trade off between full employment and inflation, which developed in the 1970s. And then in the latter part of the 1970s, this gave way to neoliberalism and to the idea that well, there was a trade off and it was just impossible to get to full employment without having inflation. And this was something that came out of the Phillips curve idea.
Right.
And people took that very seriously during the 1970s.
Right. Okay. If you don't mind, I wrote this article that I'm never going to be releasing. So if I just would like to just pick a couple of ridiculous quotes from this person that designed or founded CMT and CBI, and then we can say goodnight. Okay. Yeah, this is what I advocate. Where I put it? This is what I advocate. Calibrating the basic income to the maximum level the economy can sustain. We don't know what that level is. We gradually increase the amount until we start to reach the productive capacity of the economy. That's how they calibrate. Yeah, it can be hard to say exactly how much of the policy that we have in general, just all policy, is as a result of a lack of effective mechanism to get spending money into the hands of consumers. But a lot of it is because we don't have that effective mechanism. A lot of our policy is. Food is something that you would think that could be allocated by the market. If you have money, you're going to buy food for yourself. That's pretty universal. Yet we have people who are hungry. We have programs in place like food stamps, soup kitchens to try and address this problem of hunger, when it's really the fact that we haven't given consumers in the market the means of consumption to buy that food. So we have to give people money so that they can buy food instead of just giving them food. So instead of just giving people what they need to survive, we have to give people money so that they can purchase what they need to survive.
Yeah, so this is a quote from CMT.
This is a quote from CMT. This is a quote from the founder of CMT on one of these two videos that I watched.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
He says, the goal should not be jobs. We're in the habit of pretending that we're contributing, and he goes, quote, earning our money. He actually does this double, the double quote fingers. We're in the habit of using our economic policy to make people feel like they're earning money, and it's really inefficient. So the job guarantee is catering is giving people jobs, not because they need them, not because the community needs them, even though it will chew through Earth's resources at an alarming rate. We're giving jobs to people because we don't want them to have the embarrassment of feeling the shame that they should be earning this money, as where they're saying we just deserve the money because we're human beings. And then just two more. Regarding the job guarantee, regarding MMT, I don't really think they've thought this through. I have some ideas, but I won't pretend to have completely figured out how to ensure that everyone has dignity, meaning, and purpose in their lives. But I'm pretty sure the answer is not to force people to spend their time doing make-work jobs. At least that's not the answer for everyone.
So my comment on that is just, okay, comes from a freedom standpoint. Okay? Some people would like to have jobs, would like to have work. They should be free to have those jobs. The job guarantee is one way, okay, of supplying that freedom, okay, to people. I think that people should also be free to sustain themselves without actually having a job.
Yup.
And so I think the basic income is one way to supply that kind of freedom, okay, as well. And so I favor both the job guarantee and a basic income.
But the job guarantee is primary.
Well, to me, the job guarantee is primary because I think that most people, okay, are going to want to have a job.
And this summarizes up, I think, best of all, of where they're coming from. They say that full employment can be achieved by either giving everyone a job or just by giving them enough money so that nobody chooses to have a job. So giving everyone a job just by raising the basic income high enough that nobody without a job actually wants one anymore, which is this philosophy that a job is inherently bad, where we know that a job can be expanded to be things that are not in just making a rich guy richer.
We know that jobs can be very rewarding, and people can want jobs. Okay, and people can make jobs for themselves because they want work to do. I mean, but people go into business not only because of the money they can make by going into business, but also because they want to create a job for themselves that they want to do, and not a job that someone else wants them to do. So, people want jobs, and some people don't want jobs. And I think we ought to supply both types, okay, of freedom.
And we should expand the kinds of jobs dramatically, like even
Absolutely.
somewhat what you and I are doing right now. We are sharing knowledge with people. We are doing something that you and I would call productive, you know.
You bet.
So it's expanding what it means, what value means, what a job means, what productivity means, so there you go. Okay. Joe, I was not as focused tonight. Thanks for hanging in with me.
Sure.
The concepts, the whole first half of this with all those crazy debt concepts, I just need to keep reading. I actually don't really exactly know where to go to fill in those blanks. But it'll happen somehow. But next time we talk, we're gonna read Sam's paper, in 2 weeks from now. I really look forward to that.
Okay.
My first interview on my podcast was with Sam for his previous paper, so I look forward to this new one.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Joe. I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So I'm going to take you out of here.
Well, good night, everybody.
Okay.
See you guys later.
Everybody. Okay, so folks, okay, so it's now pretty late. Okay, I take it you can still hear me. I don't need to have my earphones anymore, which is good because they were kind of getting to me. Since it's pretty late, I'm going to have to skip going through the comments tonight. But I thank you very much for being here. And I thank you very much for any sharing that you did. Hope it was a lot. And once again, we really hope for Johnny Axum to get well soon. We hope he's back before he and we know it. So best wishes to Johnny. And best wishes and good luck to us all this is a tough time. Now we have to keep on trucking. We have to keep on trucking. So thanks very much for coming. And I'm going to end the broadcast now. Good night.